Begin. Welcome to another meeting of the Multitenancy Working Group. And on our agenda, I think it's Tasha. So if you want to take it away, you can go ahead.
Are they here at the meeting?
Yeah, I think there might be some sound difficulties on Tasha,
okay.
Maybe, or I don't know. Are you there, Tasha? Yeah, I don't think we can hear. I've tried to make up jokes. I'm just kidding.
Hello.
Nice.
We were trying to be so clever.
Yeah, we were being fancy. It didn't work. Cool. Is this enough of a group to kick off?
I think so. It's up to you.
Okay. Hey, I'm Tasha. I think I've met a bunch of you previously. We had been talking at the last meeting about this idea of soft multi-tenancy and looking at how sort of different enterprises have achieved that within Kubernetes using existing constructs to simply have basically the ability to share a cluster between multiple different groups. And so I was hoping we could kind of continue that conversation and get some different examples from different groups who are kind of doing the same thing and see if we have parallels in implementation and ideally just kind of maybe kick off a doc and kind of like start kind of looking for similarities between how we're locking down the clusters and then also with the conformance tests, what tests are we always failing because we've locked down the clusters and just kind of seeing if there's some parallels that we could start to use to define what maybe multi-tenancy looks like in Kubernetes using existing constructs. Does that make sense to everybody? Any questions about that? Cool. Let's see. So I did put a doc together that I will make public and, you know, comments, questions kind of tended more to spring start conversation than be any sort of like, this is definitely how we're doing it path. So I can share that out and kind of get everyone's thoughts. I included how we're currently locking down a multi-tenant cluster just as sort of a point of reference, and I assumed other people would have ways that they are locking down multi-tenant clusters as well that we could kind of use to share and kind of collabo in that. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, cool. Let's see. I'm just gonna make this public. Okay, so I'm putting the link here. Oops, it just went to Jay. There you go. And then I can share the doc too, but let's see. Cool. Okay, so put some reference links up at the top. I'm sure everybody has looked at these before, but just some kind of docs that, you know, I've gone through to kind of inform my thinking around some of these topics. The introduction kind of goes over, you know, there's more than one type of multi-tenancy. There's a couple different definitions of a tenant. For this proposal, we're focusing on a single use case, which I think it sounds like a lot of people have already run into and implemented. which is this idea that I am running a single Kubernetes cluster. I wish I am an enterprise, so I have not opened this up to the world. I don't have to worry about complete randoms on the internet attempting to attack this cluster from the inside. But I am sharing it between different business units or different groups. And how am I achieving what we're calling soft multi-tenancy in this way for this use case? So what we were thinking would be good is once, if other people are also running into this use case, and it seems like there's some parallels that we can use to start having a stronger definition of what soft multi-tenancy in Kubernetes is and looks like. What would be cool is if we could, agree on a set of rules. How do we achieve soft multi-tenancy and make a profile of that to share with the community? And then some follow-on things we could do is add a test harness for a multi-tenant cluster based on that definition, add a docs page to Kubernetes for how to configure a cluster for multi-tenancy, and then also come up with and this was just kind of an idea of what different profiles for standing up different clusters looks like. And that's like a bigger conversation for probably SIG architecture, but this idea that there are different ways to set up Kubernetes clusters for different reasons, and is that a profile, and kind of what do profiles look like? Any questions about that so far? Okay. So we thought maybe some good ways to get started is to kind of share multi-tenant constructs from different groups, see if there's some common patterns in how we're setting stuff up. There might be some really good ideas. We might be all doing it in exactly the same way already. And then also share current test failures or skips, and to inform both new test harness changes and also kind of show some of those common patterns that are already occurring. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that one of the interesting challenges around conformance is if you create the ability to just say, all right, I'm going to create a profile, I'm going to give it a name, and off the back of this profile, I'm going to basically say, we should fail these conformance tests because of this profile. I can see that potentially leading to a kind of, like a slippery slope argument where people say, well, and then anyone could just define a profile if they're failing conformance tests and just say, well, this is our own unique thing that fails these particular tests. And the whole idea of conformance kind of goes out the window. So I think in trying to explore like what is special about soft multi-tenancy and sort of making the case that it's not that, right? It's something that is very common to a lot of people and maybe should be well defined and should have a set of tests that's well defined to it. I think that's partly the argument that we need to make, right?
So, am I echoing? Okay. So we had a bunch of suggested processes for how we could arrive at a draft proposal, define our assumptions, define explicitly the parts of the control plane which are shared in this model and the risks involved, building off of Jess's hard multi-tenancy definition. We wanted to define the high-level areas that require an opinionated approach, and then also and then define the delegation model between admin and consumer. Define what's meant by extensibility in this model, and understand and quantify the impact on testing and compliance. I think probably this is better if everyone just wants to read it and comment and kind of collabo on that piece. It's definitely not, every possible idea that everyone could have. So it's pretty open for comment and edit there. And then down here, we just shared kind of how we're currently achieving multi-tenancy in this example. So we kind of go over, what are we doing with storage classes? What are we doing with network isolation? We have a couple pieces we need to fill in. And then tenant namespace roles and role bindings. So yeah, it's a lot to look at. And then we have the current conformance tests that we're failing. And a couple people have sent me a link to one that Azure was having trouble with, I think back in June or something. I think that's a really good example of a test that is one that you can't that has a problem, that should probably be addressed too. So yeah, this is kind of in a nutshell what we're looking at, what we'd like to talk about. I'd really like to kind of open the floor. Is anyone else on this call kind of currently looking at soft multi-tenancy?
Hi, this is Sanjeev at Cisco. So yes, my team and I are also in the early stages of looking at multi-tenancy. And this looks like a good set of thoughts that you've drafted, so that's great. And I'm happy to contribute my bit. One quick comment was that this working group seemed to have had a few draft documents in the past, some of which have been translated into KEP. Would it be useful just to catch everybody up to understand whether this would be the new master document for the group, or whether this is a supplement or an addition document to ongoing KEPs, which are doing things like namespace templating and security profiles? It would be good to also lay out where this document stands within the set of documents that this multi-tenancy group wants to put out. Or
Yeah,
is
I agree.
Yeah.
I was going to bring up exactly those two projects. We have some work that we've talked about in the past on security profiles that it's related to this. And there was at one point an effort to try to formalize those in conformance. The effort was kind of dropped for reasons I don't entirely remember, although I was involved in that discussion. I know one of the reasons was that the SIG architecture told us that RBAC is not considered like a core part of Kubernetes, and therefore you couldn't you couldn't include it in conformance, or something like that. I have to go back and look at my notes on the discussion, but I think that we could try to resume that effort to have some kind of conformance profiles related to multi-tenancy. And then, the third part is the namespace KEP that you referred to. That is, I guess one mechanism for enforcing certain kinds of policies that are on a namespace basis. So kind of at the mechanism layer of the stack. But I think all of those are relevant, and I don't know if there's I don't know what the right answer to your question is. I guess I'd be interested in input from other people about whether this document should incorporate those, or is this document intended to become a KEP, or should we incorporate the ideas from this document into some of the KEPs that have already been written? I guess there's a variety of options. Or should we discuss this document for a while, like via comments in the document, and see how that goes, and then figure out what to do later? That might be another approach.
Yeah, I would definitely be interested in kind of linking to the KEPs that you all are chatting about, and at least kind of having those at the top of the document so people know that they're there and can also see them as they look at this document.
I mean, I can understand the argument that says RBAC is not part of core Kubernetes and therefore maybe isn't part of compliance. But I think the reality is that this touches more than just RBAC, right? It touches privileged containers. It touches the defect, the bug that you mentioned, which is like exec privileges or whatever it is. There's all sorts of. I mean, it may touch daemon sets, right? If you want to be able to limit the number of nodes a daemon set's deployed to for a particular tenant, for example. It may touch more areas than RBAC, and I think maybe it's identifying what those areas are and calling those out, and that might be a helpful starting point.
Yeah, sorry. I just want to clarify. I didn't mean to suggest that that effort was hopeless. I was trying to remember the reasons that we got discouraged and kind of suspended working on it. And by we, I think it was just a couple of folks at Google. I don't think that it had gotten too far in the community, but we had brought it up to SIGARCH just as a general concept and got that feedback about RBAC. But I totally agree with everything you said. I didn't mean to suggest that meant that it's not possible to do some kind of
no. I didn't take that as your. I didn't read it that way either.
About this point about whether it should be part of conformance tests or not, I think we can anticipate, we all seem to be anticipating that this is going to be a bit of a gray area in terms of whether this is just a recommended design practice or whether this is a mandatory set of capabilities. And it seems like, at least initially, it would be a set of deployment recommendations more than a mandatory component of Kubernetes. So maybe we can differ, maybe it needs to be an optional part of conformance until such a time as the SIGARCH people have a consistent view on what parts of multi-tenancy should be actually standardized versus what is just a design recommendation. Because a lot of these things are just design recommendations, do this RBAC rule, do that, and, set up the network policy this way. And one would debate whether that's actually a standard or just a recommendation.
Yeah, I think that I haven't been following the conformance work, unfortunately, but I mean, I know they do have this notion of conformance profiles, and I think that the idea that we had that we kind of stopped working on, but was that you could have one or more multi-tenant profiles. So it wouldn't be like your distribution would fail conformance if you didn't follow these rules. But if you wanted to say that you conform to the multi-tenant profile, like it would be like an extra thing that you could claim that you conform to, that would be in addition to kind of the standard conformance test. So I mean, I think that's a reasonable model, and I think that is still something that they're planning to do, that we could think about and try to get more details on.
Sorry.
I'm the new guy here, and I've been on the list for a couple months, but just struggling to get my bearings or to make this meeting. So I've been watching a lot of the videos mostly. My name's Jay Beal. I'm historically, I was one of the Center for Internet Security's original tech leads and wrote their Linux security benchmark, and I wrote Bastille Linux, which was a long time ago was kind of the main security hardening tool for Linux. It was an open source project. Nowadays, my main interest in this space is at InGuardians, where I work, we keep getting brought in on Kubernetes penetration tests, and so we've been hacking Kubernetes clusters a bunch, and constantly saying, guys, you've set this up, like either someone's created a product for soft multi-tenancy or they've even created a product for hard multi-tenancy. And I'm just finding myself saying to these product vendors, like, don't do this. They're not, the Kubernetes project hasn't figured out what they're doing for multi-tenancy just yet. I would, and yet product development has been moving, which, so anyway, I'm sorry if I spoke too long right there. That's my, why am I here? In terms of what I'll say from my own experience, both in my former life, it's not that former life, but in my former roles where you're trying to get people to do proactive security, and in my current role, my current life where you're being brought to hack things that weren't so good, the best thing I can say is at the very least, I'd really want to encourage anything that would land you on a specific small number, whether it's 1 or 3, or 2 standards that people could choose from, and be able to 1, kind of easily apply that, and 2, easily measure whether it's been applied. Because if it's not, I mean, I think there've been lots of great talks at KubeCon and so on that have basically said, the defaults are where most people end up. If you don't, if your default is too weak, that's what most of the clusters that we'll ever see in real life look like. And so I just wanted to voice a strong opinion that, you know, whether it's I'm the new guy with only so much experience. I'm just trying to help, but so please take my opinion with whatever grains of salt you'd like. Thanks.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense, and I think, you know, related to that, there's kind of a user experience question that's implied by these levels of configuration, right? So, you know, we find that when you configure a cluster for multi-tenancy, there's a couple sort of distinct roles that emerge of like someone that's the administrator of the cluster, people that are administrators of namespaces, and people that are users of namespaces. And as you go through, you know, the Kubernetes docs, they don't take into account those different personas. And so, you know, looking at it from that perspective of making sure that when you have configured it with these policy objects, that the user experience for each of those three personas is whole, that there aren't, you know, gaps where like, oh, it's completely unusable because you don't have this permission, but if I give you this permission, it's gonna make the whole cluster insecure. So from my perspective, that's I think an important outcome of like having some standardization, is making sure that, you know, we're filling in the gaps where there might be holes in the kubectl or the API surface area to accommodate those different user roles.
Agreed.
Yeah, I'm Sally. I'm with Red Hat and OpenShift, and I worked on the OpenShift online team for a bit. So that was a really great example of multi-tenancy. I think it was our starter cluster. It was like a try it before you buy it multi-tenant cluster. I think there was like 20,000 users at one of the clusters that I worked on, and so it's just a combination of like recommendation. You know, I would say it would be a combination of like common sense recommendations when using Kubernetes or containers in general. Like, you know, we don't allow you to run as root inside of a container. Other things like SE Linux, seccomp capabilities, those are taken care of with security context constraints in OpenShift or in Kubernetes. That would be like pod security policy. And all of this boils down to a combination of RBAC and policies. And then we have a special networking, our OpenShift SDN. We have our OVS multi-tenant plugin that isolates pods from different projects. And that's the other thing. We have the project object that is a wrapper of Kubernetes namespaces, and that allows Overshift to set like a limit per user. This user can only create one project and can only, you know, see that one project. Things like that. It's just a big combination of capabilities and policies and RBAC. Yeah.
Those are observation as well, that you know, in terms of, you know, levels of sophistication, that there exists today, you know, sufficient policy objects to configure Kubernetes for some of these forms of stock multi-tenancy. And so, you know, without trying to extend Kubernetes at all, you know, documenting like how that sort of opinionated use of those policy objects can be done today. You know, with that as a baseline, you know, a subsequent effort might be to look at what extensions to policy or new capabilities might we want to add to that to achieve, you know, hard multi-tenancy or other things. So, but we can kind of take a phased approach rather than trying to bite it all off in one cap.
Sally, did you have any of this written up anywhere, like blogs about how you did it, what you did? Anywhere?
That's a good question. I just in preparing, knowing I was going to this meeting, I looked through our docs in OpenShift, and there's actually quite a lot of good information there. If you go to docs.okd.io, for instance, with the security context constraints, if you just look under additional concepts and authorization, you'll find a bunch of stuff there. But yeah, docs.okd.io. And I was thinking that I would write this up in a blog. because I recently created a blog.
That would
All
be
right.
great. It's just,
Cool.
the other question I had was, you mentioned a project construct. Do you feel like extending the namespace construct would be the ultimate goal rather than wrapping it in a whole new object? Or, was that kind of where you guys wanted to end up?
That's a great question. I would have to look into that in order to answer it. It's funny, I started at Red Hat and started using OpenShift before knowing what Kubernetes was. So I come from like OpenShift only, and I was like, oh, that's not in Kubernetes, that's new to me, things like that. So I'd have to look into it.
It would be interesting to understand what the delta between the namespace and a project is. And then
I can talk a little bit about it if you want.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Erica.
The project concept became absolutely necessary as a way to really have the multi-level access controls on the namespace division. So a lot of the policies apply at the namespace level, but you want within the namespace people to be able to do whatever they want, except configure the policies that govern that namespace.
Mm-hmm.
So in order to achieve that, we have the kind of project wrapper, and through a project request that enables users to kind of self-service namespaces without them being able to configure the strong policies that we put over the namespace themselves. And having some sort of wrapper or like that, I think, is necessary for a multi-tenant operation. Whether it should be a one-to-one relationship with namespaces, like if that was the best decision, is a little bit more up in the air.
So just as an aside, one of the things that namespace population KEP that the gentleman mentioned earlier in the call was trying to make some of that functionality available to just bare namespaces. So like just stock upstream Kubernetes, a way to have the administrator say automatically populate new namespaces with certain policy objects in a way that the user couldn't override, and that would automatically happen when the user does the self-service namespace creation. So like, I think that we should, take a look at the different options. And I'm not sure that, introducing a project concept in upstream Kubernetes is the only way to achieve that. But certainly it doesn't work today in upstream Kubernetes. So that's kind of why one of the reasons we have that proposal.
Yeah, that's exactly what the project request template does. So in OpenShift Online, any new user gets configured with any new project that a regular user creates is configured with the project request template, and it limits how much CPU. I think it's limited to like either 1 gig or 2 gigs. A whole bunch of constraints are put just right in that project request template.
Yeah, and exactly, and that was I forgot the name, the project request template name. Thank you for bringing that up. That was really the kind of functionality that we were intending the namespace population feature to provide. There may be other parts of project concept that are not incorporated into that namespace population KEP, but that one was the one that we were targeting. Yeah.
Okay, so specifically then, that's namespace lifecycle management, like which persona gets to do that and how that's governed, basically.
Yes, and it has an element of self-service as well, so that teams of users can, on a self-service, self-serving manner, create and delete namespaces just like they would projects in OpenShift.
I see.
So I think what we, as somebody said, let's document what can be done with existing Kubernetes objects and align those with these two KEPs and understand from folks what the status of those KEPs are. And then the third stage would be, entirely new objects. But before we get to the third stage, the first stage would be just using existing Kubernetes without the KEPs. The second stage is possibly integrating these two KEPs. And then the third stage would be even more capability.
I guess one question I have, what's the status of those existing KEPs, like for the namespace templates? You know, should we assume those things go forward and skip that first stage and do this like with the expectation that those KEPs get pulled into Kubernetes, or is it worth excluding them from an initial step? I just don't know about the maturity of those or the acceptance level.
So I can't remember the status, and it's one of my colleagues here at Google is the one who wrote that KEP, although with a lot of consultation from Clayton Coleman from Red Hat, and I pinged him to see if he could come to the meeting. He's in another meeting, so he can't attend, and I don't remember the status of it, but we should take a look and before deciding.
Okay, and it's probably easy enough to, you know, merge them in if we decide that's appropriate.
I think we'll still need that first stage of what you can do today, because I think people need solutions today, and these KEPs do imply some new code, some new CRDs, and so on, which wouldn't be immediately available. So I think there's value in having the document of what you can do with existing Kubernetes 1.11 or 1.12.
I want to, sorry, new guy again. I want to echo that, or I want to plus one on that, because just to echo what I said earlier, there are lots of people already doing this, who are already trying to do multi-tenancy, and if you could give them this is the right way to do it for now, that'll protect people for the next year.
Good.
Yeah, it seems like the project construct is as much about scale as anything. Like, you know, Sally, you mentioned 20,000 users. Like, I can imagine in that scenario, you know, it's very useful to be able to have another level of subdivision and its hierarchy. In a smaller case where, you know, maybe you're talking more like, you know, 100 users or less, having projects mingled. So, you know, having something that, you know, each user gets a namespace or each team gets a namespace is something that most companies on a smaller scale should be able to work with.
Although, just to be clear, the projects map one-to-one with namespaces, so it doesn't incorporate a notion of hierarchy.
Oh, okay, then I misunderstood it. Okay.
Could you do it?
I've heard that to me more the problem of, you know, if you're, you know, in the distinction between a cluster administrator and a namespace administrator, we're kind of jumping into the weeds here a bit, but, you know, you don't want a namespace administrator to be able to write their own quotas, okay, for example. Okay. So that's probably something that the cluster administrator says, like, this is how much you get by default or something. And so the project serves to, my understanding of this, serves to separate that so that a cluster administrator can control those limits. Okay. You can still create a namespace, but you can't override the limits that the cluster administrator has set for you. Okay.
Yeah, and it's interesting, as a regular user, if you try to do anything like OC get namespaces, does not work. You can only do OC get project, and if you OC delete namespace, that doesn't work, but OC delete project works. That's, yeah, the way it works.
Yeah, I mean, I'll admit that as a user coming in, looking at namespaces and saying, okay, as a namespace, does a namespace belong to a team, or does it belong to a project?
Yeah, it belongs to an application. Like that's
or does it belong to an application?
That's how I think, but maybe I'm wrong too.
Yeah, we've definitely seen a move to having them more represent part of a project. It gets a little bit more complicated with our operators and that kind of architecture where you have a whole nother level of delegation going on. But in general, we see people needing to group applications together mostly.
Yeah. And I guess it depends also what policies and capabilities you provide with a namespace. If you're saying that a namespace by default has strong network isolation, well, then people will use it in a way that's consistent with that, right? And, you know, it all boils down to what you associate with the namespace.
Yeah, and then there are certain times when you need to access your pad needs to access a different namespace, like, you know, you have Prometheus running and you want you want to access that. So you have to use the OC admin, or not OC admin, you have to use the cluster admin command to like join the pod networks. I'm not sure if that's an OpenShift thing or a Kubernetes thing, actually.
Okay.
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 We're going a little bit into detail here, but I'll just mention one relevant point to this is that if you treat a namespace as meant for an application, very often you will find the need for selective transparency between two namespaces. Meaning, and that's how I believe the OpenShift SDN also has the ability to selectively allow two namespaces to talk to each other.
Yes, that's what I was referring to. Yep, that's correct.
So then it gets kind of a little bit gray. Maybe let's just get one model working and documented, which might be something like, you know, a namespace equals a project equals a fully isolated domain, and hence a particular team that needs to have two applications talk to each other should deploy both applications in the same namespace. And they have the ability to then add other network policies or pod policies within namespace if they want some kind of intra-namespace isolation between two applications. But a namespace is meant for more than just one application. A namespace is meant for a team and any number of applications that team wants to.
I feel like that's kind of an administrative decision that a customer can make. I mean, I'm not sure that it's important to say whether a namespace is an application or a team. Like, what's important to say is that, like, these are the kinds of policy controls we can put on a namespace.
Sure.
And so, you know, one scenario, like one team might decide to put multiple microservices inside of a namespace. There's certainly a level of convenience there because you're not going to have to deal with like cross namespace network policies or things like that, you know, and maybe that works for your team. But I think that, you know, one of the scenarios of the enterprise soft multi-tenancy where I have multiple teams sharing a cluster is that it will always emerge the scenario where I have a service in namespace A and a service in namespace B, and I need to enable them to talk to each other. And I think, you know, the difference from core Kubernetes is that, you know, while core Kubernetes assumes there's like a flat network namespace and everything's always open, you know, what we observe in the namespace tenancy model is that you essentially have like a default deny network policy on every namespace, and you need to whitelist another namespace to be able to talk to you. And so whether the things inside that namespace are a team or an application or multiple applications kind of becomes an administrative decision, you know, but the constraints of the system or the way that the network policies are structured, that governs like sort of what you're able to control.
Right. Yeah, definitely. We don't want to explicitly state that namespace is meant for an application or namespace is meant for a team. But just to follow up on that point about, it was just a suggestion that maybe as a starting draft, we think of a namespace as holding multiple applications potentially. And if you really want the isolation, well, you deploy two different namespaces. But if you want, we don't want to get into that selective leakage between namespaces just yet.
Why not?
Well, just to stage things one by one, right? I mean, maybe we start with the concept of namespace is an isolated domain. You can always go outside the namespace through external services and talk to another namespace, just like if it were running in another cluster. But
I think, I guess, you know, my rough thought on that is like I feel like, you know, like Kubernetes today has network policies, which, you know, accomplish exactly that scenario of, you know, controlling east-west connectivity between namespaces. And so I guess, like, first of all, I feel like that's definitely in the domain of what's possible and useful in Kubernetes today. So regardless of what we say a namespace is, handling that scenario of enabling or disabling cross namespace network connectivity is a thing that we should document and capture. I guess, you know, I'm inclined to say, like, I feel like we should hold back from saying whether like what a namespace is. Like a namespace at some level, it's just a collection of Kubernetes objects. And whether you choose to use that for a team or a single microservice or a bunch of related microservices is kind of up to the end user. I'm not sure that it's important for us to define that here. I think
Right. Sorry, not to
changing policy objects, like if we really want to change the way Kubernetes works to, you know, try to take a more opinionated approach on a namespace, then if we want to go down that path, then I would agree with you. But
no, I completely agree. I'm repeating what you're saying. We are not going to say whether a namespace is meant for an application or a team. That was an internal point.
I maybe heard the opposite of that.
No, but to take a very quick partial analogy with OpenStack tenancy, in an OpenStack tenancy, implicitly tenants are isolated, and you can always deploy multiple applications in the same tenant. And we just various degrees of selective leakage can be something we pick up once we have an initial working draft of the baseline model. I think that selective leakage, there's a potential for some amount of grayness in that. But I think we are saying the same thing here. But essentially, what we're saying is the conclusive statements are: number one, a namespace is not explicitly meant for just an application or just a team. But in general, it could be targeted for both those use cases. And let's draft out a scenario where we can get fully isolated namespaces working and documented, and then we can talk about selective leakage.
Mm-hmm. I think to some extent that brings us back to the sort of process towards getting that proposal that we put in our document, right? So we start with defining some of these assumptions. We move on to talking about like what are the high level areas that are impacted by multi-tenancy and needing soft multi-tenancy, and then move on from there. So can you go down, Tasha, to that section?
Oh, yeah.
Are we sharing it?
No.
Wow. Okay.
I keep being torn on that question of making at least making a default, even if you give a choice. And it's almost a documentation question. Like in documentation, would you say for soft multi-tenancy, we might recommend that you use one namespace per team. Though some organizations use one namespace per app, and you're welcome to use it however you like. But what if there was what if somebody who is the concern I have is for companies for companies that are new to Kubernetes and are trying to figure out what do they do. I really like this idea of giving them at least one good, really strong example where maybe things aren't quite as open-ended.
Yeah, and I think part of that is laying out the risks, right? Saying, okay, this is how it's configured. These are the choices we've made. So like in this bullet list that we're sharing here, for example, like the question of where you draw isolation boundaries is really important, right? If you say to people, pods from one user can end up on the same node as pods from another user, and therefore they're in the same fault domain, you should understand the implications of that, right? You need to know what that means. And so I think by coming down, and sort of in an opinionated way and saying, here's the simplest way to getting this business value. Here's how it will impact you, and here's how you can assert that it's correct. I think is basically where we landed.
Perhaps, from, maybe one of the things we want to add to the output of this is like a use case or scenario. So for example, if we were documenting, hey, here's how you configure policy objects for multi-tenancy, maybe it's either part of the docs or maybe there's even like a blog post or something somewhere that says, hey, here's Coca-Cola. They've got app teams A, B, and C, and they're maintaining microservices, 1 through 10. And we sort of walk through how that maps onto the constructs that we're documenting in this approach.
Yes, absolutely. And also,
you would also offer an opportunity to highlight some of the different design choices that you as a customer could make. So you could talk about the trade-off of putting multiple services into a namespace or separating them across namespaces.
agreed, we should do that. And also we should show an example of a full workflow integration with this. For example, CI/CD workflows integrating into a multi-tenant cluster. I think there could be some things there which we haven't yet fully thought through, or at least I haven't fully thought through. Some of us haven't.
And then when we're done, Jay, you can attack it. Is that the deal?
Can you repeat?
I said when we're done, you can attack it.
I'm always happy. I'm always happy to. I'm an attacker I'm an attacker as a profession. So all it takes to get me to talk about how I'd attack it is just the question. That's awesome. I think the other question I just want to bring up is, and it's only because I haven't spent any time with service meshes, but as I talk to people, they talk about using service meshes more for network isolation than network policies. Does any of this, if things are moving in that direction towards where service meshes become more and more popular, does that in any way affect this?
I mean, I would say like we said with the KEPs, I would say let's start off by just focusing on core Kubernetes and what's in the docs and the system right now. And then over time, as namespace templates come in and as Istio becomes more widely prevalent, we can start to incorporate those into the model.
Thanks for answering my questions. And by the way, if anybody feels like I've spoken way too much for somebody on their first, the first meeting where they're not just muted, feel free to send me a private chat or email, smack me around. I'm happy to be more polite.
No, I feel like the signal to noise ratio on this call has been pretty great. So.
I don't even know who wrote the Istio blog that I just linked, but I thought it was pretty interesting. And
cool. Yeah.
So yeah, you can check that out.
Okay. So we've got like 10 minutes left. Do we want to talk about next steps before our next calls in 2 weeks? I would love to figure out if we could, collaborate on this document and start to fill out some of these sections.
Yeah. And David, maybe you could share the links to the KEPs and check with your coworker about the status, as you mentioned earlier. So we could just kind of all be on the same page with that. And I definitely love for all of you, and feel free to share the doc too. I can give edit access to anyone who wants to add the way you're looking at it or links to the way you're looking at it, but just kind of, and if you want to, look at kind of what our suggestions are for getting started, like add and edit there too. I'd love for this to be a super collaborative thing that we can all get behind.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that sounds great. I'll definitely add the KEPs to it. Also, I might link to, I don't know, I don't want to be too self-serving. I gave a talk at KubeCon in Austin earlier this year about multi-tenancy that talked about kind of how the different multi-tenancy features fit together and how they can be used. It might be interesting if people haven't seen it.
We loved it.
Yeah, it's a really good talk. I think we should totally add a link to it.
Oh, okay, thanks. I'll add that along with the KEPs. Sure.
You made the rounds around here, David.
Oh, okay. I'm flattered. Thank you.
And I think I heard Sally volunteer to write a blog by the next 2 weeks.
Oh yeah, that'll keep me on my toes. All right, I will.
So Jess and David, what is the best way to share this doc? Should I move it into a folder under the working group, or what's the right thing to do there?
I put it in the agenda, so hopefully that's good. And then probably like mailing it to the mailing list too, just in case like they miss the meeting.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I wasn't going to open up edit access to everybody, maybe just comment access. So if you want edit access, just shoot me your Google ID. I'm just tasha.drew@gmail.com.
Nice.
And was that David with the talk at KubeCon? Could you put that in the chat so I could see it?
Yeah, sure. It might take me a minute to find it, but I can do it hopefully before we're done today.
Are you on Kubernetes Slack?
Rarely.
Oh, okay.
But I'll put it in the chat. I have a link to it somewhere. I'll put it in the chat before the meeting. As long as if we can drag out the meeting a few more minutes, I'll be able to.
Thanks.
I think this might be a little premature, but I think we should definitely think about perhaps getting together during KubeCon Seattle and having some face-to-face working discussions.
Yeah, we didn't have a, I don't know, Jess, if anyone contacted you. Nobody contacted me about a multi-tenancy working group deep dive. We've done those in previous KubeCons, but we don't have one in this one, but we could definitely get together informally for sure.
If you guys need meeting space, my office is basically across the street or about 2 blocks down from the convention center. So I'll just throw it out. I'll book you a conference room.
Cool. All right.
Okay.
Sounds good, right?
Yeah, and actually, David, oh, you found it. Okay, awesome.
Yeah, I just found it, yeah.
Okay, cool. Okay, we got that. Okay, well, thank you everybody so much. And let's get together in 2 weeks and see if we can move this forward, because that would be awesome.
Cool.
Sounds good.
Sounds good.
Thanks.
Okay.